Good morning. Thank you for joining me again. We're going to take up the Gemara on Daf Nun Aleph Amud Beis 51b, and it's a very picturesque and very, very visual Gemara that lies ahead of us now. And that follows the Mishnah that we did last week as well, which was very visual and simchadik. The Union, if you remember, was that of the Simchat Beit HaShoeva and the celebrations that took place in the courtyard of Beis HaMikdash in the Ezrat Nashim. That took place each year during the days of Sukkot, starting on the Motzei Yom Tov for the first day in the evening. And the celebrations took place in the Ezrat Nashim, very much like our, possibly like our Simchat Torah, but more so. And they lasted the whole night until the next morning, until the Kohanim and Levim were ready to leave the Beis HaMikdash again, make their way down and collect some more water for the libation of the New Day's Simchat Beit HaShoeva, of the libation of wine and water for the next day, because this happened every day. So it was like an all-night party, you can imagine. And I shared a picture with you, which I will share again, if I can find it. Let's just find the picture. It's higher up in my, get to see some of these things later on. A lot of excitement to come. And I shared this picture with you. You remember? A great fun. So you had the musicians, and they're on the 15 steps leading down from the holiest part of the Beis HaMikdash into the Ezrat Nashim. This whole area here is Ezrat Nashim. It wasn't just for Nashim, but women generally didn't go further than the gate at the top of the stairs. It was called the Ezrat Nashim, but it was used for general purposes, a collection of individuals and public events and affairs that were related to the Beis HaMikdash. And you see, apart from the musicians, and there would have been hundreds of musicians playing their various instruments, the flute and the lyre and the harp and the cymbal and all the others, and maybe trumpeters. You also have thousands of people who collected in the courtyard below, and they have torches in their hands, and they would dance during the night with torches. Sounds like a little bit of a dangerous activity over here before health and safety. And there would be juggling and sports and all sorts of wonderful goings on until dawn the next day. And the Mishnah also described how these enormous flaming street lamps, almost you might say, that look just like street lamps, were set up only for the occasion of the Simchat Beit HaShoeva ceremony, which took place all night. Otherwise, there wasn't much all-night activity. There was not much nightlife in the Beis HaMikdash. It was only during these celebrations that there was nightlife. So they set up these very, very tall poles, and there were large fuel containers on the top, and they with oil. And the Pirchei Kohanim, it said in the Mishnah, the young Kohanim, the ones who like to have fun, these are pre-bar mitzvah bochrim, used to run up and down these ladders. You can see these ladders over here. Again, health and safety problems. And they would set fire with fuses to the rag, to rag steeped in oil, and would produce this incredible blazing effect. And they would keep that going all the way through the night. And the Mishnah said that when these lights were lit, all the streets of Yerushalayim could be illuminated by the light of the celebrations in the Beis HaMikdash. You can see they're up very high, and they were very prominent. So no doubt the blazes could be seen around the fairly small town of Yerushalayim, as it was during the times of Bayis Sheni. Now here we're describing the situation during second temple period by Sheni. Everything would have been on a slightly different scale, and there would have been perhaps different activity during the Beis Mikdash Rishon. But this is what we know from, if you like, eyewitness reports, which have come through to the Mishnah as the way the celebrations took place during Bayis Sheni. In the morning, when the celebrations stopped. The Mishnah also told us that the Kohanim, the Levim, they would file back out again up the steps, and they would go through the other side of the Beis HaMikdash, come out of the gate, and make their way down to the Shiloh pool to collect some water. So it was a bit like, it was almost like a circular event. Celebration, and then at the end of that, collect some more water, come inside again, korbanos of the day, libations, new celebration, all-night party again, etc. So they did have some fun at the time of Bayis Sheni. It wasn't all doom and gloom as sometimes we think. So let's take up the Gemara now. So the Gemara over here on Daf Nun Aleph Omid Base 51b starts almost at the level where you can see the text widens across the page. 2 lines above it, large Gimel Mem in bold print, that's the Gemara. Everything I described so far was actually in a very, very long Mishnah, a very long descriptive Mishnah. The Gemara is going to add to some of these details, and it's going to take us almost on, I should say, a cook's tour of the wonders of the Jewish world at the time. So it's going to be quite an exciting ride. So let's start with the Gemara. Tana Rabbanan. The Gemara brings here a brisa as a description of the beauty of the event of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. And as it does so, it wraps up some of the other wonders of the Jewish world in the same statement. And it's a famous statement. Misha lo ra Simchas Beis HaShoeva, says the brisa, Tov Reish, which starts the Gemara's Tana Rabbanan. Our rabbis taught, Misha lo ra Simchat Beis HaShoeva, someone who never witnessed the Simchat Beis HaShoeva, lo ra Simcha miyamav. He's never really seen what a Simcha is like. Every other Simcha he may have gone to will pale into insignificance compared to the splendor and joy of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. That's the claim here in the brisa. And now we have some other parallel claims. Misha lo ra'a Yerushalayim b'sivarta, someone who never saw Yerushalayim in its glory, the architecture of Yerushalayim, the beauty of Yerushalayim cradled between the hills. And here again, we are talking about probably Herodian times, Yerushalayim, when the city was at its zenith in terms of splendor, in terms of the appearance, at least the physical appearance of the city, not necessarily the spiritual. We're talking here more physical than we're talking about spiritual. Someone who hasn't seen Yerushalayim in its greatest splendor, lo ra krach nechmat me'olam, has never witnessed a beautiful city in his lifetime. He's never seen any city that's beautiful. If he hasn't seen Yerushalayim, what is Paris? In fact, they say, what was Rome? Even Rome couldn't compare to the splendor of Yerushalayim at the time. And some of the Roman writers say so. That the wonder of the Beis HaMikdash on top of the mount and the landscape was quite awe-inspiring. And finally, Misha lo ra Beis HaMikdash b'vinyano, someone who never saw the Beis HaMikdash, the structure of the Beis HaMikdash, the architecture, the buildings itself, while it was in its full function. And again, let's assume we're talking about Herodian times, but the Gemara is going to ask which Beis HaMikdash in a moment, so I shouldn't really anticipate it. Someone who never saw the Beis HaMikdash in its full splendor, lo ra'a binyan mafur me'olam. He's never actually seen a beautiful building in his life, because any building of grandeur that he may have seen, again, will pale into insignificance, will really be nothing in relation to the grandeur and beauty of the Beis HaMikdash. It was such a wondrous piece of engineering. That's what the Gemara, that's what the brisa has to say. So now let's carry on with the Gemara. So the Gemara asks a question over here. Mahi means what is it? But you can see from the answer what the question is. Very often you can't understand the question from the question because it's so open. But the Gemara is asking really, which building Beis HaMikdash are we talking about over here? Yeah, we've had Bayis Rishon, we had Mishkan as well. We had Bayis Rishon and we had Bayis Sheni. And Bayis Sheni was rebuilt several times, as was Bayis Rishon, which started off as a wooden structure and then was rebuilt by Shlomo HaMelech into a beautiful building. Bais Sheni also started off at the time of sorry, I'm talking about Bais Sheni now. Bais Rishon started off. It was built by Shlomo Melech, and then several times, even Chizkiyahu and others, they also shipputzed, if you like, the Beis Hamikdash. So it would have changed in its appearance, and it would have expanded. Bais Sheni expanded several times and reached its maximum opulence at the time of Horus. So the Gemara answers, Omer Abaye, he answers, V'yitema Rav Chisda, either Abaye or Rav Chisda is responsible for this answer coming now, Ze binyan Horus. This must be talking about the structure of Herod. In other words, the description we see over here could only fit the binyan of Horus. This, if you haven't seen this version of the Beis Hamikdash, you've never seen a splendid building in your life, must be referring to the optimum structure of Bais Sheni, which is at the time of Horus. And again, the Gemara's argument will be that Bais Sheni was more opulent than Bais Rishon. Technology had improved. Roman builders were there to help. And during Bais Sheni, at the outset, with the return of Ezra and Nehemiah, it was a pathetic little building, which people who had seen the previous building were weeping. You read Zechariah and Nehemiah, and you can see that it was nothing. It was only later on that it was improved at the time of Hashmonaim. Ultimately, it was rebuilt almost entirely, and the Har HaBayis was built up with this great mound, and the wall that we see around, which is the restraining wall of Har HaBayis, which is the western wall, was then built. All this is the work of Herod. So he says we're obviously talking here about the work of Herod and not any earlier manifestation of the Beis Hamikdash. And now the Gemara asks an interesting question. It wants to know, how was this Beis Hamikdash at the time of Herod? What did it look like? How was it built? So it doesn't give us a diagram, unfortunately, and it certainly doesn't give us any photographs. So we just have to make the best of the description, which is given now. So Gemara says, "B'mai banye," how was it built? The impressive structure of Horus. So Amar Rava, so Rava answered, "Ba'avnei shaisha umarmara." We don't know what everything is over here. Avnei shaish, you know, shaish means marble. Even today it means marble. Your kitchen has shaish, so you know it's a very popular word. If you have shaish in the kitchen, so it was marble umarmara. It suggests that it means it was pale blue, a blue and white marble. Possibly means that, or blue marble with white streaks, or white marble with blue streaks, however you want to imagine it. Now, I think we're talking about the structure of the Heichal, the sanctuary, the great big building. We'll talk about the flooring separately. We're now talking about the great structure, which was the Ulam, the Heichal of the Beis Hamikdash, where there were internal Mizbeach, the menorahs, where if you went further through, you went to the Kodesh HaKadoshim. We're talking about that large building. Now, Ikadomri, others say, Ba'avnei shaisha kuchlo marmara. I'm not sure how different this is. Blue and white marble. And the Gemara goes on to give you a architectural commentary on how the stones were aligned and placed on each other, which isn't too easy to understand, but let's go on. Apek sofa, ba'ayil sofa. Sounds to, the descriptions given here by the Mefarshim are, that means that a row of stones would project outwards and a row of stones would project inwards. Let's try and work out what that means in a moment. I've just translated, I'm not giving you more than that. Why? Ki hechi de lekabel sida. In order that there would be a place to attach the lime or the cement that was to firm the structure up. And we'll see, I'll try and explain that to you in a moment. I'm not sure whether I'm right or wrong, but let's just go on with a description. Sava lemish'ayon b'dahava. Originally, Herod or his builders or his aesthetic advisors, when they were rebuilding the Beis Hamikdash, they thought to line the stonework with gold, literally, so that the housing on the Beis HaMikdash would be vertically lined with gold foil all the way. So you'd see gold, sparkling gold buildings. Quite impressive. That's what they thought to do as, the ultimate covered, if you like. But Omrule Rabbonon, the Chachamim said, no, don't do this. Shavkei, leave it unlined with gold. Don't put any gold foil on it. Why? Because it looks even better like this. It looks better with its marble than it would look if it were gold lined. Why? Because it now looks a little bit like the waves of the sea. Yeah, the waves of the sea, the blue waves of the sea. And you look at this building and it gives an overall pale blue, a mottled and whippled impression, which reminds you of the waves of the sea. So let me just share with you, first of all, I'll share with you some pictures that might help to implant the Torah's meaning here, the Gemara's meaning here. So we've just seen this. Let me just go over the next piece. Now, what I've got you here is a diagram of actually Herodian stonework. This is from the Kotel. The Kotel, you've seen this all the time. You may not have noticed the structure. Sometimes if you're going around with a guide, they tell you how the stones were placed on top of each other. Now, these are not the stones, therefore, of the Heichal in the Beis HaMikdash, but they may give us an impression as to what the Gemara means here by a row coming out and a row going in. So if you look over here, you find that the lower stone here, which is probably around ground level, if you like, has a lip which protrudes, and the one above it sits, it says here, 1/2 inch in, and there's a 2-inch vertical ledge. So it seems that the stonework above the bottom row of stones is set in further by a 1/2 inch. And it could be the one higher above is set out by a 1/2 inch, which gives it this sort of in-out effect. Now, next time you're at the Kotel, maybe you can try and see whether it's there or whether it's not there. This is actually a real thing, and it's a fact. But you may not be able to see that faithfully produced in every level of stone, partly because the stones are being relined, etc., etc. So that could be what the Gemara means by the expression apik sofa va'ayil sofa. What about the cement work? Well, it says that it was done this way. Either we've done this way, either because it's aesthetic or because it actually produces a better engineering balance to the building than rather having a totally smooth vertical face without any movement inwards. I thought it was maybe just an engineering thing. But the Gemara says it's in order that it could take some adhesive or cement. And the Mefarshim say that's because if you look at the stones, they're placed on top of each other, yeah? If you have your tiles in the kitchen, your tiles on the kitchen and the wall usually have grouting between the tiles. But where's the grouting? Where's the cement placed on top of the lower level of stones here, on which the second level of stones is resting? Should it not be cemented in for greater stability? And the answer is it wasn't. It wasn't necessary because of the great weight and the great thickness of the stones to do that cementing. But the Gemara seems to be suggesting that although they didn't want to put the next level of stones on a layer of cement, they wanted some sort of cement edging, so they would have placed some cement here on this 1/2 inch. If you like, it would be like a bordering tape along the top of the lower level of stones at the base of the higher level of stones. And there would be cement, you would be able to see visibly some line of cement or grouting, we might nowadays say. That's the best description I have of this Gemara. I mean, I don't have any drawings to help me, but that may well be what it means. The Gemara has spent its time telling how beautiful the Beis HaMikdash was, and we talked about the blue, and we talked about the whippled effect and the marble. So over here we have a most magnificent depiction of Bais Sheni, and here's this splendid building. Over here, by the way, you see again. This is where the musicians were standing. This is the Ezras Noshim again. That's where the people had their flames. It was here that these large light fittings were fit. But through a next gate, here's the great building behind it, built further in, which is the Heichal, which contains the Kodesh Kadoshim. It's very high, was an extraordinarily beautiful building. And what you see over here, you see here magnificent pale blue stonework. This is what the Gemara is talking about. What you see here is a depiction of what the Gemara's description here is, that there was blue and white marble. This is blue and white marble. And it has a sort of Whipley effect. And from the distance, it would look like the sea, almost. I mean, it's a vertical sea, but it has this beautiful impression. And the Chachamim said, rather than line all these walls with gold, leave it as it is. It's splendid. So apart from the effect, by the way, of the splendor of the walls, as we see over here, that's the description. Just as an addition, the Gemara had said, someone who hasn't seen this magnificent structure before has never seen any beautiful building in his life, because nothing compares to this. This is the, this is pre Abu Dhabi and whatever it is. This is real beauty architecture. If you look at the floor of the chutzner here, what do you see? Tiles as well. So this particular picture is giving you an impression that not only was the Heichal itself and the structures, the vertical structures in the Beis HaMikdash made of beautiful marble, but the floor tiling of the chutzner was magnificent as well. And in fact, Josephus describes it as being absolutely magnificent. The flooring was absolutely magnificent, as well as the building within. And the what is very interesting, only about 6 or 7 years ago, you may have seen a newspaper cuttings, or it was even the Jerusalem Post. It was in all the Jewish newspapers. You can see these are reconstructions of, and there are many others, of the floor tiling of the chutzner of the Beis HaMikdash, that which would have been in this above picture in this area here, which is giving you an impression of that. And this was only put together 5 or 6 years ago. It was an absolutely amazing piece of work. Very small parts of the marble flooring were discovered over many years in the Temple Mount sifting project, which many of us have been on to. Thousands and thousands of pieces, and they were like of quartz shapes, and they were of different colors. And the different colors were of different shapes, if you like. Some of them seem to suggest that they could be fitted together to make diamonds, others to make triangle end pieces. And archaeologists, together with mathematicians, were using computer simulations to see how these pieces could be fitted together. And they came up with a number of potential tilings that would have worked. And here are two. It's possible that the Beis HaMikdash flooring and the chutzner would have had both of these in different places. In other words, you could make up a jigsaw of the quartz tiling or the shaish tiling in the Beis HaMikdash floor into these sorts of geometric shapes. And these are the geometric shapes that were popular at the time in some of the Roman and Greek world. So this fits absolutely with the types of structure we expected. And not because a single tile was found whole, but because they did this reconstruction work from all those tiny little bits and pieces that were found. Quite a remarkable piece of archaeology combined with computer modeling that put this together, because they couldn't possibly rearrange all the stones they found to make any one of these complete tiles. But overall, it gave them that these pictures were makeable, if you like, from the pieces that they'd found. So that shows you how beautiful the flooring was as well. And this explains the wax lyrical content that we have here in this Brises, the Misha Lo Ra Beis HaMikdash B'Vinyono Lo Ra Binyon L'Form. Someone who's never seen the beauty of this Beis HaMikdash has really never seen any structure of great beauty, because nothing else will compare. Okay, now the Gemara goes on with another set of you've never seen anything like it statements. So this Gemara is full of tall order stories, really. Have you ever seen anything like it? The Gemara goes on to say here, Tanya, it was taught in a brisa. This is a very, very famous piece, and we've done it before, actually, probably about 7 or 8 years ago in a different Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda said, Mi shelo ro'a deyupluston shel Alexandria shel Mitzrayim lo ro'a bichvodon shel Yisrael. Someone who never saw, who was unfortunate enough that he never saw the Diapluston in Alexandria of Egypt, has never seen a building so well built to honor the Jewish people, so grand for the Jewish people. It's the grandest compliment to the Jewish people you find, not in Eretz Yisrael, says Rabbi Yehuda, but in the Diapluston shel Alexandria. So what are we talking about over here? We're talking about, as we'll see in a moment, the great shul in Alexandria. Let's go back for a little bit of history. The whole history of the Jews in Alexandria is a very astonishing one. Indeed, the Jews in Egypt. At the time of Chorban Bais Rishon, at the hands of the Babylonians, the Jews were taken into captivity and moved to Bavel. Some of them remained in Eretz Yisrael, and you remember you have this Gedalia ben Ahikam. The Gedalia remained as the leader of the remnant of the Jewry in Eretz Yisrael, who tried to rebuild themselves. The Babylonians didn't mind that because they were just a small remnant, and they would be puppets of the Babylonians. Around the same time, there were problems, there were assassinations, and the remainder of this Jewry from Eretz Yisrael moved to Egypt. In fact, even Yirmiyahu went down to Egypt with them. Jeremiah, who had been in Eretz Yisrael, went down to Mitzrayim as well. And there was born a huge community of Jews, a large Golah, and it was almost the main Golah for hundreds of years. It took a while to build up. It thrived during the Hellenistic period and the early Roman period. And the Jews, particularly in Alexandria, became very, very wealthy. Now, Jeremiah actually condemned them, and he said, look, you can only be here a short time, because eventually the enemy powers are going to come down to Egypt and they will destroy you as well. But you know, when you're doing quite well, you stay where you are. Everyone had nice houses, they were comfortable, they built beautiful shuls, and in fact, the edifices in Mitzrayim, because of their wealth, you know, were way over the splendor that could be afforded in Eretz Yisrael. So there was this thriving community there. And the famous shul of Alexandria, which is described in many places, was called a Diapluston. Why? Because a Diapluston, Dia means two, it's a double colonnade. It had a double colonnade. It was truly magnificent. You can imagine it to be almost like, you know, the temples of Karnak, or what do you see, of Abu Simbel, or whatever it is. Huge edifice, as we'll see in a moment, built at enormous cost. And someone who's never seen this has never really seen an attractive shul. This is the shul to be, you know, even the shul of the bells today in Yerushalayim wouldn't come close to that at this Diapluston. And Omru, and they said about it, Kamin Basiliki Gedola, it was like an enormous basilica. Maybe it had a huge dome over it as well. Doesn't exist anymore, as we'll see in a moment. Hoisa. Stav lifnim stav. There were colonnades within colonnades, and then the seating in the middle. And then the Gemara now brings, or this Brisa brings, all sorts of what are clearly exaggerations to make the point. Yes? In order to make the point that there really was nothing like this. So says the Brisa now, Pa'omim, it happens sometimes, Shahoyu ba, Shishim Ribo, Ashishim Ribo, Kiflaim Kiyotse Mitzrayim. The Girsa here in the Gemara is not certain things in brackets. The number of people in the building sometimes exceeded twice 600,000, 1.2 million, double that of the population of those who left Egypt. So great were the numbers accommodated in the shul. Now, actually, the community in Alexandria at its greatest was huge. It's said that there might have been 200,000 or 300,000 Jews in Alexandria. We are talking about a major city of Jewish influence at the time, and that later on was going to be part of its downfall. But that's how strongly populated. So although this is an exaggeration, it's not such an exaggeration. Maybe they couldn't all fit in, but there may well have been tens of thousands of people trying to crowd into this great basilica. Again, this sounds a little bit like the Purim story, Achashverosh's banquet. And there were 71 enormous thrones of gold, covered in gold, in the shul. If you like, chairs for mechubadim, for very honorable nobles who would be sitting in the shul. Keneged shivim ve'echad shel haSanhedrin Hagadola, to correspond to the 71 people who made up the Great Sanhedrin. The Great Sanhedrin, when it was in Yerushalayim, had 71 members. Now, the Sanhedrin was not here in Alexandria. It doesn't mean that. It means that when they decided how many noblemen's chairs, if you like, to install for the noblemen, whoever they were, they thought, well, you know, there are 71 members of the Sanhedrin. Why don't we have 71 katedros, 71 of these nobleman chairs? These are like thrones. Kol achas va'achas, each of one of these chairs, well, it says ribbo, the word ribbo should certainly go out. Each of these had gold to the weight of 21 pieces of gold, chunks of gold, kikarizah. Okay, exaggeration, but to make the point. And in the middle of the shul, amongst the thousands of seats that were obviously there apart from these cathedros, there was a bima, and the bima was made of wood, presumably carved wood. So that was in the middle, not at the front, but in the middle. And by the way, this is taken to be one of the primary sources for a shul to have a bima in the middle and not in the front. This was a major area of contest between the Reform and the Orthodox. It almost defined a shul. Many shuls later on in time, in order not to be seen as Reform, had started off with a bima in the front and moved it to the middle. I'm not talking about where the Chazan davens from, but where the Kriyas HaTorah is from, etc. In an Orthodox shul, it is meant to be in the middle, and this is the model for that there was the bima in the middle. What was it used for? The Chazan HaKnesset and the Chazan of the Beis HaKnesset, and Chazan doesn't mean Chazan, Chazan means Shamash or Gabai. Nowadays we use the expression Chazan for the Shliach Tzibah. That was not the use in Talmudic times. In Talmudic times, it was the Gabai, if you like, who was called the Chazan. What would he do? He would Omed Oleha, he would stand during davening on this bima in the middle where he could be seen, because the bima was raised above the ground. V'hasudorin biyodo, and this is very famous, and he had flags in his hand, maybe different colors, and he used to wave them. But given she'egia la'anos omen, when the Shliach Tzibah had reached a point where the Kehila should answer Amen, Halomenif Basuda, the Gabai would wave the flag to notify people that it's time to say Amen, and everybody would answer Amen. Now this is famous, but people couldn't hear. It was such a big shul, there were no microphones, so therefore people in some corners of the shul didn't know where the Shliach Tzibah was up to. And therefore, you know, if he's finished a bracha and the Tzibah should answer Amen, the only way people would know would be by gazing up at the bima and seeing whether the Chazan was waving his flag or not. And if he waved his flag, they would say Amen. Now Tosfos already here and other places asks a kasha against this. How does this make sense? What kind of frum shul are we talking about over here? Is this a frum shul? Is this conservative? Is it reform? What kind of shul are we talking about over here, where the audience can't even hear the Shliach Tzibah davening? Someone has to wave flags. Moreover, according to the Gemara and Brachos, a person is not allowed to answer Amen to a bracha he hasn't heard. Just because someone sort of shakes his head and or you see him moving and you think you read his mouth and he's reached the end of the bracha, it's called an amen yisoma, an orphan bracha. If you haven't heard the bracha, you can't answer amen. You hear the bracha, you answer the amen. So what's the point of the chazan here waving his flag if the audience can't hear? They have no right to answer amen. And yet the Brisa here says they answered amen. So this bothers Tosfos a lot because it goes quite against the law that we have of not answering amen if you haven't had the bracha. So he gives several suggested answers, each of which is a real kvetch in itself. And you can see, and he's straining, really straining to try and find a worthwhile answer. One answer is he says, well, you know, he would only wave the flag for amen if it wasn't an amen that was really needed by the tzibur. In other words, it wasn't one in which the shliach tzibur was being motzi the kehillah. The kehillah don't need to hear it. There are some places that the kehillah does need to hear. If he needs to say, should we say amen to Kedusha or to Kaddish. But there are other places maybe where the amen is less important. And he gives an example of Kriyas HaTorah. When a person goes up to have his aliyah and he makes a bracha at the Torah. Now really, you should listen to him make that bracha and answer amen, but it's not a chiyuv. If you haven't heard him make the bracha, you don't have to answer amen. Under those circumstances, if, shall we say, someone came up to the bracha to make a bracha at the Torah in this shul in Alexandria, it was at that point when the person making the bracha reached the end of his bracha, the chazan would wave the flag because it was not a compulsory amen. It was only an optional amen. So whether you heard it or not, it didn't matter. So it's nice to say amen then, even if you haven't heard it, then he would wave the flag. So it was only to a restricted number of brachas that he would wave amen. And another answer Tosfos gives, really, which is, I'm not quite sure whether I understand it correctly, is that it's taken for granted that somehow the audience in the shul, even though they may not have heard the brachas, they knew which bracha was being made at any one time. They knew by their watch. They'd say, I don't know, 8:17 and 40 seconds, he will just be saying, Baruch Atah Hashem, blah, blah, blah. So at that point, the flag would go up and they would know what bracha. So when they were answering amen, they would know for what bracha they were answering amen. And under those circumstances, maybe that's not called an amen yisoma. Maybe the circumstance under which you're not allowed to answer amen to a bracha you haven't heard is if you don't know what bracha was being said. But if you happen to know what bracha was being said, maybe you put a great big siddur, maybe they had a screen up to say what bracha was being said, then maybe you can answer amen even if you haven't heard the bracha. So these are all attempts by Tosfos to answer how it would be halachically legitimate for the audience to answer amen simply because a chazan waved a flag, but the audience hadn't heard the bracha. Okay, let's go on in this description over here. I've just done Meinif Basud of Cholam Onim Amen. Okay, V'lo hayu yoshin mu'urovim. And they were not sitting, the audience, the kehillah in the shul, were not sitting. Mu'urovim means mixed together. Now everybody will think we're talking about men and women. We're not talking about men and women. In fact, probably it was so taken for granted that there were no women in this shul, it doesn't even need to be said. We'll be talking about women when it comes to the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, but the shul in Alexandria may not have had a women's gallery at all. So that what does it mean that they didn't sit and mix together? The Brisa tells us in the continuation, Ella, but it was segregated by profession. Zahavin bifnei atzmon, the gold craftsmen were sitting in their groups, the chasofin, the silversmiths, bifnei atzmon, within their groups. There were separate sections of the shul designated for the different trades. The napochin and the iron merchants or the iron hewers or whatever they were doing there, they used bellows and they melted iron and to make ironwork. Bifnei atzmon, they had their own section. The tarsayim and the copper smiths, they had their own section, bifnei atzmon. The gardayim and the weavers, people involved in cloth, bifnei atzmon, were also in their own section. Why was that? So the Brisa gives us a reason for this. Ukisha'ani nichnas sham, it says when a poor person would enter into this grand shul, we're not going to be talking necessarily about a poor person, but a person, shall we say, coming in, he's from the outside, he hasn't been there before, yeah, he doesn't have membership in the shul, and he doesn't know where to sit. So what, you expect what? The Gabbai to come down to him, take him by the hand and find a row for him. It was even better at the time. The Gabbai worked even harder. When this Ani entered the shul and wanted to know where to sit, he would search out people who were in his trade. Yeah, because it was like the supermarket. It said, it would say tissues and paper in this section. This section is for spices, next section is for frozen goods. Over here, he would see the sign, or the Gabbai would come to him and ask him what was his trade, and he would take him to sit with Baalei Manasseh, with people in his trade, the Nifnei Lasham. And as a result of that, Umisham, Parnososo, Parnosas Anshe Beso. And by getting to know the people in his profession, he would be enabled to start up and work better, find himself a position in the town. Quite interesting over here. We often think about competition. People don't want anybody else to come in onto their patch. You don't want somebody else coming into the town who's got your profession. He might take some of your income away. This is the opposite over here. In this grand shul, a person comes in and he's experienced in silver work, but he's coming into Alexandria and he doesn't know anyone. He goes into the silver section and he shouldn't talk to during davening, but on the way out of davening and outside, he would be able to talk to the people who he was with, and they would help him out. They would tell him what was done, what wasn't done, what machinery was available, where there were spare jobs, and he would therefore and thereby be able to find parnasa. Okay, so that's the description of this great shul in Alexandria. Actually, it's difficult to know whether this brisa is meant to be, if you like, a paean of admiration for Alexandrian Jewry, or a form of cynical criticism. You can take it both ways. What you can see over here is that the whole place was totally beyond scale. It was opulent beyond belief and wasteful. But at the same time, it had this level of civilized dignity in it, that the people were helped out if you came in. I don't know whether you'd like to daven in a shul like this. Were the Rabbi Yehudas from Eretz Yisrael, was he being critical? Or was he essentially saying, what a wonderful Jewish community we have worldwide. You go to Alexandria and you'll find your place, because there's a shul there that invites everyone in and will provide you with an income. You could look at it either way. Nevertheless, that's the brisa in description of Alexandrian Jewry. The Gemara goes on to say something very interesting, which is that this age of splendor of Alexandrian Jewry came to an end, and it came to a brutal end. And just as actually Yirmiyahu had said it would, they would be comfortable there for a while, but they weren't supposed to be there. They were supposed to either be in Bovel, where the rest of the exile were, or maybe they could go back to Eretz Yisrael, who asked them to escape down to Egypt. At the time, Egypt might have been alluring. It was like the United States. You're coming out of the pogroms, you found yourself to the promised land that was, the streets were lined with gold. But it wasn't the place that was supposed to be. So Amar Abai, this is what the Gemara is now going to tell us. It's going to tell us how it all ended. V'kulhu kotlinhu, all Alexandria Jewry met its end. It means they were killed. And who killed them? Alexandros Mukdon, Alexander the Great. Well, is it Alexander the Great? Maybe it isn't, but let's just go on. My Tama Ianshu, what was the reason that the Alexandria Jewry, in all its magnificence that we've just described, had to meet such a savage end? What was their sin? And this is an interesting and very famous reason given. Mishum de Ovri Ahaikra, because they have violated the following posuk: Lo Tosifan Lo Shuv Baderech Hazer Od. See whether I can actually share my screen. Interesting enough, this posuk is a warning against the king in Parsha Shoftim, in Sefer Devarim, not to have too many wives. Yes, he mustn't have too much money. He shouldn't have too many horses. So this is the horse paragraph. Rak lo yarbe lo susim. Any king who is appointed in Israel should not have too many horses. V'lo yoshev es ha'am Mitzrayma. And I've highlighted this bit. And he should not bring his people back down to Egypt. Laman harbo sus. In order to get more horses. Egypt was the capital of the world for stabling horses. All the fine horses came from Egypt. And in the same way as you might go to Florence today to see all the great galleries, etc., you know, the Renaissance artists, anybody who was interested in horses would go down to Egypt. And they would be very captivated by Egypt. So the king has to be very careful. The king's going to want to have a large stable. So he's going to have very, very strong relationships with Egypt. And eventually he might want to, you know, even build himself a summer house in Egypt. This is the Torah saying, no way, don't get allured by the gloss of Egypt. And it was the horses of Egypt that were alluring at the time. V'Hashem amar lachem, did not Hashem say to you, lo sosifen lo shuv b'derech hazer od. You shall not continue to come, you shall not ever return through this route again. What does that mean, the route? The route from Mitzrayim, out of the Yotzei Mitzrayim, came into Eretz Yisrael. Don't ever go back that way again. You left Egypt, that was the final time you're supposed to see Egypt. And no one should find their way back again. Now, this passage talks really about the risks of, you know, of horse fancying and going down to Egypt. But if you read the verse, it goes on to say, Lo so sifen lo shubader chaser od. And this is taken as being a lo sase in the Torah. The Torah says, don't go back to Mitzrayim. So anyone who's been down to see the pyramids recently has to scratch his head and wonder whether he's done the right thing. We are not allowed. There is a boycott here of Mitzrayim. And we'll have to see how the Jewish people, have got around that boycott. Because we obviously did in many ages for different reasons and different excuses. However, the Gemara says, what was the end of Alexandria Jewry? It was punishment for the fact that they violated this command wholesale. Hundreds of thousands of them not only were there because they were cast off from Eretz Yisrael, but they thrived there. And they continued to stay there and thrive there. And there they imbibed a lot of Hellenistic culture, etc., etc. And this was such a severe Aveira that although they were, so to speak, allowed to thrive there for centuries, their time eventually came to an end where they had to give din and cheshbon, give account for the violation of what is a serious crime. The inner Hadorosim, these people decided to come back again to Egypt. And therefore, Hashem said they have to be punished. And according to this paragraph, Alexander the Great punished them. But there's a real problem with this Gemara. And the Vilna Gaon straight away changes the girsa in this statement of Abaye. It could not have been Alexander the Great. It was Alexander the Great who founded, they say, the city of Alexandria in Egypt. It just started then. So how could he have destroyed the Jewry at the same time? There couldn't have been a community there, hundreds of years of an opulent shul, if it was only founded, if you like, by Alexander the Great. Obviously, there were cities there before in the vicinity, but not here. Now, this was really a new project. It was a new town, if you like. So, and also we know historically, this is not what he did. What we're referring to over here, according to the Mefarshim, who look into this, is it's the revolts of the Jews against the Romans during the emperorship of Trajanus, as he was called, the Trajanic revolts. And they were just before the Hadrianic revolts. Between 70 and 122, whatever, between the Chorban Bayis Sheni and the Bar Kokhba revolts, there was an upsurge of revolution, very much amongst Jewry against the Romans throughout the Roman Empire. And a lot of these revolts were put down. A major revolt, almost the major, all revolts just before the Bar Kokhba revolt was in Alexandria in Egypt, where there were hundreds of thousands of Jews well placed. And it was already under Roman rule and Roman influence. And the Jews there started revolt, and they actually destroyed the Roman garrisons at the time. And one of the reasons for that, apparently, was that Trajan was involved in a war against the Parthians. He removed large numbers of his troops, leaving much of Alexandria exposed to attack. And the Jews themselves took it into their own hands to revolt against the Romans, who imposed heavy taxes on them and so forth. And this was the Trionic revolt against Trajan. He came back, suppressed the revolt, and killed hundreds or very many tens of thousands, destroyed the whole of Alexandria Jewry, and it was well documented that he destroyed the Grand Synagogue in Alexandria. The date is around 115 to 117 CE, just before the Bar Kokhba revolt. So we're talking about that particular revolt against the Romans, not Alexander the Great 150 years or whatever it is earlier, but this revolt against the Romans. But again, the pshat doesn't change. The Gemara is saying that the end of Jewry there had to happen, because in a sense they'd asked for some repercussions for violating the Aveira. And it's very difficult. You can never link a particular destruction or a particular sin. After the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, look how they were destroyed just a few years later in the Bar Kokhba revolts. But there were these terrible uprisings against the Romans, which the Romans savagely put down over a period of over 50 years, maybe 100 years. Such were the turbulent periods of the time for Jewry in that part of the world. So a very, very prosperous, well-to-do and hugely well-educated section of Jewry in the Roman Empire in Alexandria were brought to a close literally overnight at the time of these revolts. Let me just go on in this Gemara. The Gemara goes on with a story, a very strange bit of the story. It says, Ashkachinhu, to have a Kori Besifra. Now, this is telling you, this is here to teach you something. This can't really have happened as it's said to have happened over here. He found them, the Jews, reading in a Sefer Torah. Who's he? So it's not Alexander. Let's say it's Trajan. But let's take the story that whoever it is working for Trajan entered the Grand Synagogue, if you like, and he saw that they were laning at the time. The Roman destroyer comes in and he sees them laning. And what were they laning? They were laning a posuk from the Tochacha. Yisa Hashem alecha goy merochok. Hashem will bring against you a nation from afar. Right. So at the moment that he enters, let's say he understands all, there's a Meturgaman who's translating it. The very verse being read talks about the destruction of Jewry. And that shows that somehow he's arrived with his troops, Trajan, at a very apt point, because they seem to be reading a posuk which is literally foretelling the events that are happening right now. Alexandria Jewry is just about to be wiped out. So Trajan said to himself, I took a boat. There are different ways of learning this posuk. That should have taken me 10 days. And I got here very, very quickly. And somehow a wind took my sails and brought me here from Rome to wherever I am now, through to Jaffa in only 5 days, which was a bit of a miracle. So probably I and my troops are the nation being referred to in this prophetic extract, which is being read from the Torah. So he got all puffed up and confident. He fell on them and killed them. What is this trying to say? Really, he's just trying to say that the Kriyas HaTorah, the Tochacha, so to speak, predicts the downfall, not just of Eretz Yisrael, but even of the Golus. And in a sense, Trajan was aware, or shall we say, Roman powers were aware of the fact that the Jews themselves had foretold of their own destruction. And it gave them the confidence to destroy, because it seemed that they almost had the imprint of God to do what they had to do. just before we close, this is the story of the Jews in Alexandria. It's an amazing story. I want to share with you an important consequence, really, of the pasuk that we have over here. We just quoted this pasuk. We said the violation of this law in the Torah not to return to Egypt was responsible for the downfall of hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Alexandria, because they violated that rule. But if they violated that rule, what happened in subsequent generations? Didn't Egyptian Jewry build itself up again? What about the Rambam, for example? Well, first of all, let's look at the Rambam living in Egypt. So here in the Mishnah Torah by the Rambam, he says the following. He says, a Jew may live anywhere in the world, chutz me eretz Mitzrayim, except Egypt. Sounds fairly clear, doesn't it? Where did the Rambam live during some of his most productive period? In Fostat, in Egypt. What's going on over here? The author of the law that says you shouldn't live in Egypt, based upon that pasuk, is living in Egypt. It destroyed hundreds of thousands of Alexandrians, and he's living in Egypt. Is he knowingly violating that law? Couldn't he have left? Okay, so this is a major question. And indeed, many other scholars lived in Egypt at the time, and in subsequent generations as well. So the question is asked by many, and the answer is given by many. I just wanted to take you through a few of the answers given, why it's all right. Now, if you're just going for a holiday, that's not a problem. In fact, the Gemara also says if you're going there for business, it's not a problem if you're going to return. But to settle, very difficult. So first, let's look at the Kafta Beferach, a well-known, lives in Eretz Yisrael. Kasher HaRambam hoyachosem shmo be'geres shlucha hoy mesayim hakosev ha'ova b'chol yom shlosha lavim ploni. This is not a reason. The Kafta Beferach brings down that when the Rambam signed his letters, he used to sign his letters with a statement, a PS, that said, I am sending you this letter, I, who transgress the violation of living of 3 violations of the Torah for living in Egypt, send you this letter. In other words, he was moda. Every time he wrote a letter, he admitted the fact that he was living and violating at the same time. Why didn't he get out? We don't know. But according to this interpretation, he was well aware, but he felt he had to stay where he was. That's one answer. Okay, so the Rabbeinu Bachai, just doing this one now, Zu mitzvah l'shah. This was only a one-off mitzvah. He says, no, don't worry about the Chumash Pasha. Kadei shelo yildu Yisrael ma'aseihem. So the Jews shouldn't learn long-term from their foreign neighbors, because the Mitzrim were a very, they were steeped in bad behavior. So you shouldn't go down to Egypt and make your life there at the beginning. So he said, but it wasn't meant to last forever. And he says that we see many very fine communities that live there even today, says the Rabbeinu Bachai. He says it was meant, if you like, for the first generation leaving Mitzrayim. You shouldn't go back. Who says I'm saying this for people 1,000 years later? Of course, a big question to this is the fact that Alexandrian Jewry were wiped out as a result. How does Rabbeinu Bachai fit that in with the fact this was a one-time mitzvah for the Yotzei Mitzrayim? The Ritva. So Ritva gives a number of reasons. He says, what do people rely on to live there today? Like the Rambam and many others. And he says something interesting. He says, you know what? Old Egypt isn't new Egypt. The old Egypt that was known then, the Egypt of the pyramids, the Egypt of the Hellenists, etc., it's all been, it was all replaced, even in the Ritva's time in the 13th century. It wasn't the same Egypt as before. And he also says that this only applies while the Jews are on their land. He adds something extra. He says, when the Jews are all in Chutz La'aretz anyway, and they're living in America, and they're living in Europe, etc., and there's only a small fragment in Eretz Yisrael, this halacha, a Jew shouldn't live in Egypt, doesn't apply. How do we know that? The Torah says you shouldn't go back the way you came back to Egypt. Well, when they first came out, they came from Egypt to Eretz Yisrael. Extraordinary pshat is The only thing you're not allowed to do is to go from Eretz Yisrael to Egypt. Yes, but if you go from England to Egypt, or like the Rambam, if you go from North Africa to Egypt, or things like that, it's okay, because you were living somewhere else. You're going from one Chutz La'aretz to another Chutz La'aretz. The Torah doesn't want someone who's already settled in Eretz Yisrael to go out and live in Egypt. That's according to this explanation. And that doesn't apply for people who were born in Egypt, people who came from other parts of the Gola. It wouldn't apply. Another reason that's given. Second. So one reason given over at Tzitz Eliezer, modern forest, says that Cairo was like a new, at the time, Fostat was like a province within Egypt. And he says it's not like being in Egypt itself, it's a bubble. And this bubble wasn't considered to be part of Egypt. And that's why he was allowed there. And he says that originally the Rambam was in Alexandria, but he moved to Fostat, Cairo, precisely for that reason. A very interesting idea with Tzitz Eliezer. Why did he move? He said he moved to Fostat in Cairo as soon as possible, because he recognized that Alexandria was still under the Klala, you should not be in Egypt. After all, it wiped out Alexandria Jewry 2,000 years earlier. So therefore, 1,000 years earlier, as far as the Rambam is concerned, as soon as it's possible, he escaped Alexandria, went to a new province in Egypt, which in a sense was like a bubble and not considered Egypt, Al-Qahira, which was Cairo or Fostat, where he was in, and that was not considered living in Egypt. We see another possible idea over here, which I'll stop sharing at this point. Very interesting, wants to say that the prohibition was only not to take the route. If you look at that posuk, literally, it says you shouldn't go back again through the route that I took you to. I've taken you out of Egypt to Eretz Yisrael, go back to Egypt. So they want to say that if someone retraces the steps, very strange pshat, that the Jewish people took, exiting Egypt to get to Eretz Yisrael, going through the Sinai desert, going around the corners and here, and taking that route, essentially trying to retrace the route. People want to do that, don't you? It's a heritage trip. You want to go back on your heritage trip. So if you try and retrace those steps, it's a violation. But if all you're doing is flying straight, if you like, or walking straight as the crow flies from Eretz Yisrael to Egypt, it will not be a violation. Anyway, I give you all those possible reasons to excuse the living in Egypt. None of them is perfect, but what is certainly true is great scholars did live there and continue to live there for a long time, which is why these reasons had to be given. But we see what it did for the Jews of Alexandria. And it is still a question that's asked nowadays. And in a sense, it relates to some other cheromim they have, like there was a cherem not to go to Spain, has that cherem been lifted, etc. If the Torah says a cherem not to go to Egypt, and people are going there to Egypt today, well, maybe we shouldn't take these bans quite so seriously. Okay, we'll stop now. I've run 4 minutes over time. Let me just cease recording. Stop recording.